The air in the obsidian court was a cold, still thing, smelling of polished stone and the faint metallic tang of ozone that clung to King Draven's magic like a second shadow. He sat upon the throne of whispers, carved from a single piece of star-fallen rock, and watched his lords with an ancient, predatory boredom. They were fey, like him, creatures of breathtaking beauty and casual cruelty, their lifespans stretching into lazy, unspooling centuries that had a tendency to curdle amusement into apathy. Tonight, the apathy was a physical weight in his chest. Lord Valerius, his silver hair a shimmering cascade over shoulders draped in midnight velvet, raised a crystal goblet. "Another flawless victory at the sanguine hunt, Your Majesty. The mortal champion barely lasted an hour." A murmur of sycophantic agreement rippled through the gathered court. Draven inclined his head, the gesture so minimal it was nearly an insult. "The mortals grow brittle," he said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very stone of the hall. "There is no sport in it anymore, no challenge." This was his eternal complaint. He was a being of immense power, ruler of a kingdom that straddled the veil between worlds, and he was profoundly, exquisitely bored. It was a dangerous state, for him and for everyone around him. It was Lord Kael, ever the opportunist, who saw the opening. His eyes, the color of twilight, glinted. "Perhaps the challenge lies not in breaking their bodies, Your Majesty, but in bending their will. Their hearts, they say, are notoriously fragile things." Draven's gaze sharpened, a flicker of interest. "Go on." "I speak of the new human scholar," Kael said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial purr. "The one granted access to the royal archives. Lyra, they call her, all fire and intellect. They say she has a spirit as sharp as Valyrian glass." Draven remembered her, a flash of a memory from the week before. A young woman with hair the color of warm honey, her head bent over a crumbling tome in the great library. She had looked up as he passed, and her eyes, a startling clear hazel, had met his not with fear or awe, but with a brief, dismissive curiosity before returning to her page. The lack of deference had been novel. "She has a spine," Draven allowed. "A rare commodity in her kind." "Precisely," Kael leaned forward, sensing he had his king's attention. "A wager, then. One for the Grand Ledger." He gestured to the ancient iron-bound book that rested on a nearby pedestal, its pages filled with the cruel and capricious bets of fey nobility, stretching back a millennium. "A true test of your legendary charisma, my king." Draven's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. The boredom was receding, replaced by the familiar, welcome thrill of the game. "Name the stakes." 30 days, Kael declared, his voice ringing with theatricality. 30 mortal days. Make the spirited human scholar Lyra fall completely and irrevocably in love with you, so utterly besotted she would renounce her world for yours. A ripple of cruel laughter went through the assembled lords. The sheer arrogance of it was intoxicating. "And the condition for your victory?" Valerius asked, swirling the crimson wine in his goblet. Draven's smile widened. This was the part he relished. "The condition is that I remain untouched. I will play the part. I will speak the words. I will weave the grandest romance this court has ever seen. But my heart," he tapped a finger against his chest, where the organ beat with the slow, steady rhythm of a glacier, "will remain as it is, a stone, cold and entirely my own." "And if you fail?" Valerius pressed. "If she resists you, or worse, if you are the one to lose your composure, then I will forfeit the sunstone mines of Eldoria to you both for a century," Draven said, the price so exorbitant it drew gasps from the court. He was that confident. Mortals were such simple creatures, their emotions like switches to be flipped. Lust, devotion, fear. He had mastered them all. Cale's eyes widened with greed. A worthy stake. It is done. He strode to the grand ledger, took up the quill, and with a flourish inscribed the terms. King Draven, 30 days, the heart of the human Lyra. His own heart to remain untouched. The Sunstone Mines as forfeit. The lords countersigned, their laughter echoing in the vast, cold hall. They were already imagining their newfound wealth. Draven watched them, a predator savoring the anticipation of the hunt. This little human scholar, with her books and her defiant eyes, would be a delightful diversion. A toy to be played with and, once her heart was thoroughly broken, discarded. He did not notice the silence from the archway leading to the archives, nor the faint shadow that slipped back into the deep recesses of the library. He did not see the figure that leaned against a towering shelf of ancient scrolls, her body trembling not with fear, but with a silent, consuming rage. Lyra pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle the sound that wanted to claw its way out of her throat. Every word had been a shard of ice against her skin. Fragile things. A toy. Utterly besotted. The clinical cruelty of it, the sheer, breathtaking arrogance, stole the air from her lungs. Her first instinct was a primal scream of terror, the urge to run, to pack her few belongings and flee this glittering, monstrous court before the sun rose. She was human, a scholar on a temporary grant, a tiny, flickering candle in this eternal obsidian night. They could snuff her out with a thought. But then, the terror receded, and something else took its place. It was the same fiery defiance that had driven her to argue with the most revered academics, to challenge centuries of accepted doctrine, to travel to a dangerous and alien court in the pursuit of knowledge. It was pride. A cold, hard, diamond-bright fury. They thought her a simple creature? A switch to be flipped? A heart to be won like a trophy? They had mistaken her for one of the simpering court ladies who swooned at a well-turned phrase. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She pushed herself away from the bookshelf, her movements silent and deliberate. The rage in her chest began to cool, solidifying into a sharp, clear purpose. He wanted a game. He wanted a challenge. He had no idea what a true challenge was. He saw her as a pawn in his wager. He didn't realize he had just become a pawn in hers. Lyra walked to the edge of the shadows, peering back into the throne room. King Draven was laughing, a sound both beautiful and terrible, like the breaking of ancient ice. His face, a mask of perfect, inhuman beauty, was alight with cruel triumph. She watched him, her hazel eyes narrowing. The fear was gone, burned away by indignation. She would not run. She would not hide. She would play. She would take his carefully constructed game and she would twist it into a weapon against him. He wanted to break her heart while his remained a stone. She would make him fall so deeply, so hopelessly, that he would forget the wager, the stakes, his own name. She would make him feel everything, while she, in turn, would feel nothing. A slow, dangerous smirk touched her lips, a perfect mirror of the king's own. In the silent sanctuary of her library, she whispered the words that sealed his fate. Game on. The next day began Draven's campaign. He found her, as expected, in the royal archives, a place that smelled of dust and decaying paper and the slow, patient march of time. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes, streamed through a high, arched window, illuminating her as she stood on a rolling ladder, reaching for a scroll on a perilously high shelf. He took a moment to appreciate the picture she made, the determined set of her jaw, the slight furrow of her brow, the simple, practical dress that could not hide the elegant line of her spine. A perfect, unsuspecting target. He cleared his throat, a soft sound, yet it seemed to reverberate in the hallowed silence. "Allow me," he said, his voice pitched to a low, intimate murmur designed to startle and disarm. Lyra glanced down. She did not gasp. She did not stumble as he had half hoped. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise that was almost immediately controlled. She looked at him, the king of this realm, as if he were a slightly inconvenient footman. "Your Majesty," she said, her tone level, respectful but not servile. "I have it." Her fingers brushed the scroll, but it was just out of reach. "Nonsense," he said, stepping forward. He didn't use his magic to float it down to her, which would have been easy but artless. Instead, he placed a hand on the ladder, his proximity a calculated move. He was taller than she expected, a looming, graceful presence. He could smell the faint, clean scent of paper and lavender that clung to her. "It is no trouble." He reached up, his long, elegant fingers easily closing around the scroll. For a beat, his hand was just beside hers, the contrast stark, his pale, ageless skin against her warm, mortal flesh. He expected her to pull back, flustered. She didn't. She simply waited, her gaze steady, until he had retrieved the scroll and offered it to her. "My thanks," she said, taking it from him. Her fingers did not brush his. It was a deliberate, almost clinical exchange. He leaned against the ladder, trapping her for a moment. "I confess, I am intrigued, Scholar Lyra. It is rare to find a mind so dedicated. What secrets do you seek in these old bones?" He smiled, a carefully crafted expression of gentle curiosity. It had worked on countless others. Lyra looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "The truth, Your Majesty. It is often buried under the weight of glorious fictions." A direct hit, though she could not possibly know how direct. He felt an unwilling flicker of admiration. "A worthy pursuit," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Perhaps you would allow me to assist. The archives are vast, and I am familiar with their secrets." He was offering her the ultimate scholarly prize, the personal guidance of a monarch who had lived through half the history she was studying. He waited for the eager acceptance, the breathless gratitude. Instead, she gave him a small, polite smile. "That is a generous offer, Your Majesty. But the joy of scholarship is in the discovery, not the answer given. To have the path illuminated would rob the journey of its purpose, don't you think?" She descended the ladder, forcing him to step back. She moved with a quiet confidence that was utterly at odds with her station. She was a guest here, a human, a temporary fixture. Yet she acted as if she belonged, as if his presence was an interesting but not particularly world-altering interruption. "An admirable sentiment," he said, recovering smoothly. He began his second move. "I came to invite you to the Solstice Gala this evening. It is the most celebrated event of our season. It would be incomplete without the presence of our most distinguished guest." He had expected hesitation, a shy refusal he could gallantly overcome. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said, already turning back to a large table, unrolling the scroll. "I will be there." Just that, a simple, straightforward acceptance. No blushing, no stammering. He felt a strange, unfamiliar prickle of frustration. She was not following the script. He had laid out the path, and she was simply walking it without any of the gratifying emotional turmoil he had anticipated. "Excellent," he managed, his smile feeling a little tight at the edges. "I shall look for you." "And I for you, Your Majesty," she murmured, her attention already consumed by the ancient text before her. She didn't look up as he left. Draven walked out of the archives and into the gleaming obsidian corridor, the silence of the library replaced by the distant, muted sounds of the palace. He felt a frown tug at his brow. This was not going to be as simple as he'd thought. Her composure was a fortress. She was not playing the part of the skittish mortal. She was playing something else entirely, and for the first time in a very long while, he did not know the rules. The frustration was irritating, but beneath it, buried deep, was a spark of genuine intrigue. The toy, it seemed, had some surprising mechanics. This might prove to be a sport, after all. The Solstice Gala was a masterpiece of fey glamour. Thousands of enchanted lanterns floated in the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom, casting a soft, silvery light that mimicked the twin moons. Music, ethereal and complex, drifted from a balcony where musicians played instruments of spun glass and shadow. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming moon petal and spiced wine. It was a scene designed to overwhelm a mortal sense, to stun them into submission with its sheer, impossible beauty. Draven stood on the royal dais, accepting the greetings of his courtiers, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw her before she saw him. Lyra had entered through a side archway, a quiet arrival that drew no attention. She had made an effort. Her dress was a simple but elegant gown of deep forest green, borrowed from the royal wardrobe, no doubt. Her honey-colored hair was swept up, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She wore no jewels, save for a single silver pin in her hair. In a room of glittering, ostentatious beings, her simplicity was a statement. It drew the eye more effectively than any diamond. She did not look for him. Instead, she moved to the periphery of the room, her gaze curious and analytical, like a naturalist observing a flock of exotic, dangerous birds. She accepted a glass of water from a serving drone, ignoring the wine. She was watchful, contained, and utterly self-possessed. Draven descended from the dais, a deliberate act that sent ripples of awareness through the court. The king was on the move. He glided through the crowd, a predator in his own jungle, his eyes fixed on his prey. As he approached, he saw Captain Reese, the handsome, earnest leader of his personal guard, approach her first. Reese was young for a fae, barely 2 centuries old, with a face that was more open and honest than was fashionable in the Obsidian Court. He bowed to Lyra, a genuine smile on his face. "Mistress Lyra, I am glad to see you here. I feared the grandeur might have intimidated you." Lyra's smile, when she gave it to the captain, was warmer than anything Draven had yet received. It was a small, private thing that lit up her face. "Not intimidated, Captain. Merely cataloging. It's a force of habit." "I hope your findings are favorable," Reese said, his gaze admiring. "They are extensive," she replied, a hint of dry humor in her tone. A hot, unfamiliar pressure built behind Draven's ribs, a possessive fire that had no place in his calculated game. He had not anticipated this. A rival? The captain's smile was an offense. Lyra's answering glance was a theft. He increased his pace, his presence announcing itself before he even spoke. "Captain Reese," Draven said, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet. The captain stiffened, his smile vanishing as he turned and executed a perfect, formal bow. "Your Majesty." Draven's eyes were on Lyra. "I trust my captain is not boring you with tales of military drills and border skirmishes." "Not at all," Lyra said smoothly, her warm smile for Reese dimming into something more polite and distant for him. "The captain was just making me feel welcome." "That is my role tonight," Draven said, subtly positioning himself between them, a physical claiming of her attention. He offered her his arm. "There is something I wish to show you." It was a royal command disguised as an invitation. She had no choice but to accept. She placed her hand on his arm, her touch light, impersonal. He could feel the warmth of her skin through the fine silk of his sleeve. It was a distracting sensation. He led her away from the crowded ballroom, through a set of moonstone doors and onto a private balcony. The air here was cooler, cleaner. Below them, the palace gardens stretched out, a tapestry of silver and black foliage under the light of the twin moons. "The whisper wind chimes," he said, gesturing to a series of delicate, crystalline rods that hung from the balcony's archway. They were utterly still. "They respond only to the purest expressions of joy. They have been silent for a very long time." It was a lie, of course. They responded to a simple cantrip of air magic, but it was a poetic, romantic lie. He turned to her, his expression carefully softened into one of wistful sincerity. "I had hoped, perhaps, that seeing you here tonight might stir them." He watched her face, waiting for the blush, the flustered reply. Lyra looked at the chimes, then back at him. Her gaze was unnervingly direct. "A beautiful sentiment, Your Majesty," she said, "but I suspect their silence has less to do with a lack of joy and more to do with atmospheric pressure and barometric stability. They are exquisitely crafted, but they are still subject to the laws of physics." She had taken his poetry and dissected it with the cold, precise scalpel of her intellect. She was not rejecting his romantic overture. She was refusing to even acknowledge its terms. She was treating his attempt at seduction like an interesting but flawed scientific hypothesis. For the second time that day, he was utterly wrong-footed. A slow burn of anger, mixed with a grudging respect, kindled within him. He had orchestrated this entire scene, the music, the moons, the magical chimes, to be a perfect, irresistible romantic tableau. And she had just pointed out the stagecraft. "You wound me, scholar," he said, letting a note of theatrical hurt enter his voice. "You strip the world of its magic with your logic." "I don't believe logic and magic are mutually exclusive," countered, her tone even. "Understanding how a thing works does not diminish its beauty, it enhances it. To know that the stars are not just silver lamps hung by the gods, but massive burning suns millions of miles away, is that not a more profound, more breathtaking magic?" He stared at her. She was not trying to be difficult. She was genuinely engaging him, meeting his fey artifice with her human reason, and she was doing it with an unshakable confidence. He had intended to lead her into a dance where he knew all the steps, and she had instead invited him to a debate where she was setting the terms. A low chuckle escaped him, a sound of genuine, surprised amusement. He had expected a mouse, and he had found a lioness disguised as one. "You are a dangerous woman, Lyra," he said, and for the first time the words were not part of the game. They were the truth. Her lips quirked in a small, knowing smile. "Only to cherished illusions, Your Majesty." She turned her gaze back to the gardens, leaving him to study her profile in the moonlight. The wager, for a fleeting moment, felt trivial. The real prize, he was beginning to realize, was not her heart. It was the thrill of this unexpected, exhilarating battle of wits. He had wanted a distraction from his boredom. Lyra, it seemed, was more than a distraction. She was a challenge of a kind he hadn't faced in centuries. And he found, to his profound surprise, that he was enjoying it immensely. He would have to adjust his strategy. The usual tactics, power, wealth, flattery, were like water on stone. He would have to engage her on her own terms. He would have to use his mind. The first week bled into the second, and their encounters took on a new pattern. Draven abandoned the grand romantic gestures. The poetry and moonlit walks were replaced with something far more potent: his time. He would appear in the archives, not with invitations, but with a rare text he claimed to have just discovered, one that happened to pertain directly to her research on prelapsarian Fey dynasties. He would sit with her, not speaking for hours, the companionable silence broken only by the rustle of turning pages. He learned to anticipate her needs, a cup of hot, spiced tea appearing at her elbow just as she began to flag, a cushion for her chair, a better lamp to ward off the encroaching twilight. These were small, practical acts of service, a language she seemed to understand better than florid compliments. In return, she began to talk to him. She spoke of her work, her theories, her eyes bright with an intellectual passion that he found himself mesmerized by. She argued with him, challenging his first-hand accounts of history. With respect, Your Majesty, your memory might be colored by personal bias. The trade treaty of the Ninth Age, according to the Ironwood Scrolls, was far less favorable to the mountain clans than you recall. Instead of being offended by her audacity, he was invigorated. No one had dared question him in 500 years. He found himself defending his positions, digging through his own vast memories for details, for evidence. He was not just a king indulging a scholar. He was a participant in an intellectual sparring match. And she was a formidable opponent. One afternoon, as rain lashed against the tall arched windows of the library, they sat across from each other at a great oak table. A map of the ancient kingdoms was spread between them. "You see here," she said, her finger tracing a faded line. "The cartographer marks the whispering peaks as impassable. But my research suggests a seasonal pass, open for maybe 3 weeks a year. A hidden trade route." "The cartographer was correct," Draven said. "The peaks are impassable. For mortals." "And for the Fae?" she pressed, looking up at him, her hazel eyes sharp with inquiry. "For us," he said, a slow smile touching his lips, "there are other ways." He leaned forward, the scent of rain and old paper enveloping them, and tapped a blank spot on the map, far from the mountains. There was a gate there, a doorway between moments. One could step through it in the lowlands and emerge at the summit an instant later. Her breath caught. It was the first time he had seen her composure truly falter. Her academic curiosity momentarily overwhelmed her careful guard. Was? It's gone? Fey magic is tied to belief, to memory. When the root was forgotten, the gate faded. It is still there, I suppose, a ghost of a door. He had not thought of that gate in a millennium. The memory surfaced, clear and sharp, dredged up by her relentless curiosity. He watched her, saw the longing on her face, the pure, unadulterated desire for knowledge. And in that moment, he wanted, with a strange and sudden urgency, to give it to her. He wanted to take her to the lowlands, to show her the shimmering outline of the forgotten gate, to watch her face as she witnessed a magic she had only ever read about. The thought was so powerful, so outside the bounds of his wager, that it startled him. This was not part of the plan. The plan was to dazzle her, to make her fall for a glittering illusion. The plan was not to share genuine secrets, to open a door into the real magic of his world. The plan was certainly not to feel this pull, this desire to see her happy. He pulled back, a subtle retreat. "A mere historical curiosity," he said, his voice regaining its carefully neutral tone. But Lyra had seen it. She had seen the flicker of genuine connection in his eyes, the impulsive generosity. Her own expression became guarded once more, the mask of the detached scholar sliding back into place. But for a moment, the game had felt real for both of them. Later that week, he found her in the aviary, a vast, glass-domed structure filled with birds of every imaginable hue. She was standing before the cage of a shadowfinch, a creature whose feathers absorbed the light, making it look like a hole in the fabric of the world. "They say its song can make a listener forget their own name," Draven said, coming to stand beside her. "A useful defense mechanism," Lyra observed, not looking at him. "To make the predator forget its prey." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and pointed. Was it a warning? A taunt? He could not be sure. "But what if the predator has no wish to harm the prey?" he murmured, stepping closer. "What if he only wishes to admire its beauty, to hear its song for himself. She finally turned to look at him. The air was warm and humid, filled with the scent of tropical flowers and the cacophony of birdsong. And what happens to the bird once the predator has heard its song? Does he leave it in its cage? Or does he grow bored and move on to the next cage, seeking a new and more interesting melody? Her gaze was like a physical blow. She knew. It was impossible, but the accusation in her eyes was undeniable. She was not just speaking of the bird. She was speaking of him, of the wager. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him, a sensation so alien he barely recognized it. Had he been so obvious? Had one of his lords betrayed him? He searched her face for confirmation, for the triumphant glint of someone who held a winning hand. But he saw only a quiet, weary challenge. He forced a laugh, a sound that felt brittle in his own ears. "You have a cynical mind, scholar. You see predators behind every tree." "I am a historian, Your Majesty," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "History is largely the story of predators and prey. It is a lesson one learns quickly." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing before the cage of the shadowfinch, the bird's silent, light-devouring presence, a sudden and suffocating metaphor for the game he was playing. A game in which, he was beginning to fear, he was no longer the predator. He was being studied, analyzed, and perhaps even pitied. The thought was more galling than any defeat he had ever imagined. He had to regain control. He had to remind her of his power, remind her who was the king and who was the guest. His next move was a deliberate display of possessiveness. He arranged for a private concert in the Crystal Gardens, inviting only a select few of the court. And Lyra. He made sure she was seated beside him, a place of honor that marked her, publicly, as his interest. During the performance, he saw her gaze drift to Captain Reese, who stood on duty near the garden entrance. They exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible nod of greeting. It was nothing, a polite acknowledgement. But to Draven, it was a spark on dry tinder. The simmering frustration from the aviary ignited into a cold, possessive rage. He waited until the final notes of the harp faded, then leaned toward Lyra, his voice a low command meant only for her. "Do not look at him." She turned to him, her eyebrows raised in faint, questioning surprise. "I beg your pardon, Your Majesty." "The captain," he clarified, his jaw tight. "His attention is unwelcome." Lyra's expression shifted. The surprise was replaced by a look of profound disappointment. "He is a good man, Your Majesty. He has been kind to me." "His kindness is irrelevant. You are my guest," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Your attention belongs to me." It was a mistake. He knew it the moment he said it. The words were crude, tyrannical, the move of a common bully, not a master manipulator. He had let his jealousy, a coarse and ugly emotion he hadn't felt in centuries, dictate his actions. Lyra's face became a cool, smooth mask. She did not argue. She did not protest. She simply inclined her head. "As you wish, Your Majesty." The rest of the evening was a torment. She sat beside him, a perfect, beautiful statue. She smiled when it was appropriate. She applauded at the right moments, but she was gone. Her spirit, the fiery intellect that had so captivated him, had withdrawn to a place he could not reach. The silence between them was no longer companionable. It was a chasm. He had wanted to assert his control, and in doing so, he had lost the very thing that had made the game worthwhile: her engagement, her challenge, her fire. The next morning, he was informed that Captain Reese had been reassigned to a remote outpost on the northern border, effective immediately. The order had come from the Lord Chamberlain, but Draven knew it was a direct result of his courtiers observing his displeasure. They were trying to curry favor, to assist him in his conquest. He felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it almost buckled his knees. He had not given the order, but his petty, possessive display had caused it. He had punished a good man for nothing more than a shared smile with a woman Draven was actively trying to deceive. The ugliness of it, the sheer abuse of his power, was stark and undeniable. He went in search of Lyra. He found her on a windswept parapet overlooking the sea. The salt spray misted her hair, and her cloak billowed around her. She was staring out at the gray, churning water, her shoulders slumped. He approached her cautiously. "Lyra." She did not turn. "I hear the northern border is cold this time of year," she said, her voice flat. The guilt was a physical weight. "I did not give the order." "Did you have to?" she asked, finally turning to face him. There were no tears in her eyes, only a profound, crystalline sorrow. "Your displeasure is as good as a command in this court. A flick of your wrist, a tightening of your jaw, and a man's life is upended. Is that not the nature of power, Your Majesty?" He had no defense. She was right. "It was an injustice," he said, the admission costing him more than he could have imagined. "I will have him recalled." "And what would that look like?" she countered, her voice sharp with a sudden bitter anger. The king, changing his mind like the weather, to soothe the hurt feelings of a human scholar. "It would only humiliate Captain Reese further. It would mark him as a pawn in whatever game you are playing with me." There it was again. Game. The word was a constant accusation. He stood before her, stripped of his usual artifice. The kingly mask felt heavy and false. For the first time, he wanted nothing more than to tear it off. He wanted to tell her the truth. Not the whole truth of the wager, but a part of it. "The game," he said, his voice raw, "has become complicated." She searched his face, her own expression softening from anger into something more complex. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the genuine regret. This was not the heartless monarch from the throne room. This was someone else, someone lost. "Then perhaps you should stop playing," she whispered, the wind whipping the word away almost as soon as she said it. She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent, weighty communication passing between them. Then she drew her cloak tighter around herself and walked past him, back into the warmth of the castle, leaving him alone on the parapet with the screaming gulls and the cold, unforgiving sea. He had wanted to reassert his control, but he had only succeeded in revealing the depths of his own weakness. He was jealous. He was petty. He was compromised. The stone in his chest was beginning to feel horribly, frighteningly fragile. He was losing. And the worst part was, he no longer knew which game he was even playing. The third week marked a profound shift. Draven ceased trying to control the game and instead found himself simply wanting to be near her. He sought her out not to score points in some imaginary contest, but because the silence of his court felt hollow and oppressive when she was not there. The witty sycophants grated on his nerves, their flattery transparent and dull compared to her sharp, honest intellect. He found her one evening in the Royal Conservatory, a vast glass house filled with plants from 1,000 worlds. Some glowed with their own soft light, others sang when the wind blew through their leaves. Lyra was standing before a Terran rosebush, a simple, mundane plant amidst the alien flora. She was touching a single, deep red petal with a tenderness that made his throat ache. He approached without a sound, content to watch her for a moment. He saw the faint sheen of tears in her eyes. The sight was a dagger in his chest. "They remind you of home," he said softly. It was not a question. She startled, quickly brushing a hand across her eyes. "Your Majesty, I didn't hear you." "I apologize," he said, his voice gentle. He gestured to the rose. "My mother had them planted. She was fond of the mortal realm's simple beauties." He had not spoken of his mother in centuries. The memory was a ghost, but Lyra's presence made it feel solid, real. Lyra looked at him, her defenses lowered by her moment of homesickness. "I miss the smell of rain on damp earth," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "The change of seasons, Here, everything is permanent, beautiful but unchanging. He understood. The eternal spring of his realm, maintained by magic, could feel like a gilded cage. Permanence is its own kind of prison, he admitted, the truth of the words surprising him. He had never thought of his immortality that way before. It had always been a source of power, of superiority. Now, through her eyes, he saw its weariness. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he acted on an impulse that came from a place deeper than strategy. He gently took her hand. Her skin was warm, her fingers slender. He half expected her to pull away, but she didn't. She let her hand rest in his, a silent, fragile truce. "There is a place," he said, "in the Western Highlands, a fold in the world where my kingdom's magic wears thin. The seasons still turn there. It snows in the winter." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a vulnerable, hopeful curiosity that was entirely genuine. "Truly?" "I could take you there," he offered. The words were out before he could consider their implication. This was not a move, this was a promise. A genuine desire to give her something she wanted, to ease the ache of her loneliness, an ache he was beginning to recognize in himself. Her fingers tightened slightly around his. "I would like that," she said, her voice soft. He held her hand for a moment longer than was necessary, the contact a quiet anchor in the swirling confusion of his own emotions. This feeling, this protective tenderness, this overwhelming urge to soothe her sadness, it had no name in the lexicon of his long, cold life. It was terrifying, and it was exquisite. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a target or an opponent, but as a person. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, and the deep, quiet well of loneliness she tried so hard to hide. And he realized, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that the wager was utterly, irrevocably lost. Not because she had failed to fall for him, but because he was, against all logic and intention, falling for her. The stone in his chest was no longer a stone. It was a heart, and it was beating with a painful, unfamiliar rhythm. The final week passed in a dream. Draven abandoned all pretense of a game. His pursuit of her was no longer a strategy, it was an instinct. He spent every possible moment with her. They walked the gardens, not for show, but because he loved to hear her talk. They read together in the library, the shared silence a form of deep communion. He told her stories of his long life, not as a king boasting of his deeds, but as a man recounting his history, his triumphs shaded with regret, his losses still sharp after 1,000 years. He learned about her life, her childhood in a small, scholarly town, her fierce love for her family, her insatiable hunger for knowledge that had set her apart, made her feel lonely even when surrounded by people. He saw the parallels in their lives, two solitary beings, isolated by the very things that defined them, his immortality, her intellect. One night, he did take her to the Western Highlands. They rode on horseback, leaving the glittering palace far behind. As they climbed, the air grew colder, sharper. The eternally blooming flora gave way to hardy pines and rugged, moss-covered stone. And then, as they crested a ridge, she saw it. A light, delicate flurry of snowflakes, drifting down from a gray sky, melting on the warm leather of her gloves. Lyra dismounted, her face turned up to the sky, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on her face. She laughed, a sound so clear and beautiful it seemed to make the very air shimmer. She caught a snowflake on her tongue, her eyes closing in bliss. Draven watched her, his heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it felt like it might break him. This was it. This was the joy that could make the whisper-wind chimes sing. It had nothing to do with magic or grandeur, and everything to do with a simple, genuine moment of happiness. Seeing her like this, so open and unguarded, was worth more than all the sunstone mines in Eldoria, more than his entire kingdom. He dismounted and went to her, taking her cold hands in his. "I am sorry," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. She looked at him, her smile fading into a look of gentle confusion. "For what?" "For everything," he said. "For bringing you here, for my court, for not being the man you deserve." She studied his face in the soft gray light, her gaze searching and intense. "And who is the man I deserve, Draven?" It was the first time she had used his name without his title. The sound of it on her lips was both an intimacy and a judgment. He had no answer. He only knew that the cruel, bored king who had made a callous wager 30 days ago was a stranger to him now. That man would have seen her joy as a point scored, a victory. This man saw it as a gift, a sacred thing he felt privileged to witness. He raised a hand and gently brushed a snowflake from her eyelash. His fingers lingered on her cheek, the warmth of his touch against the cold of her skin. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a heartbeat. It was a gesture of trust, of acceptance. It was everything he had pretended to want, and now that it was real, it terrified him. Because he had not earned it. He had built this connection on a foundation of lies. He knew what he had to do. He would end the wager tomorrow, on the 30th day. He would go before his lords and declare his forfeit. He would give Valerius and Kale their minds, and then he would go to Lyra, and he would tell her the whole, ugly truth. He would beg for her forgiveness, and he would start again. He would court her for real, with no games, no lies. He would spend the rest of his long, immortal life earning the trust she had so freely given him in this one perfect, snow-dusted moment. He had a ring. It was a simple thing, not some ostentatious royal jewel, but a band of silver enchanted to hold the light of a single star. He had commissioned it a week ago, in a moment of clarity. He would not ask her to be his queen, not yet. He would ask her to stay, to give him a chance to be the man he was becoming, not the man he had been. On the evening of the 30th day, he led her to the same balcony where he had first tried his clumsy romantic lies. The whisper-wind chimes hung silent in the still night air. The twin moons were full, casting a brilliant ethereal glow over the gardens. He was nervous. His hands felt cold, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. All his centuries of power and command had deserted him. He was just a man, hoping for grace he did not deserve. "Lyra," he began, his voice softer than he intended. He turned to face her. She was beautiful in the moonlight, her expression calm, her hazel eyes watching him with an unnerving stillness. "There is something I must tell you," he said, reaching into his pocket for the small velvet box that held the ring. "These past 30 days, they have changed me. I began this as something else, something ugly, a game." He had to tell her himself before he asked anything of her. The confession was the first step. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It was not surprise. It was not hurt. It was recognition. "But it became real," he pressed on, his voice gaining urgency. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot the game entirely. I forgot everything but you. What I feel for you, it is the most real thing in my life." He opened his mouth to ask, to propose his new beginning, but she held up a hand, stopping him. Her movement was calm, deliberate, final. The serene expression on her face was gone, replaced by a look of cold, clear judgment. "I know," she said. Her voice was not the warm, engaging tone he had come to love. It was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a scholar stating a fact. His blood ran cold. You know?" "I know about the wager," she said, her words precise and devastating. With Lord Cale and Lord Valerius. 30 days. My heart, the Sunstone Mines, the Grand Ledger. I know everything. I was in the archives. I heard it all. The world tilted on its axis. The moonlight seemed to dim, the air to grow thin and sharp. He stared at her, unable to process the words. She had known, from the very beginning, from that first day on the ladder. Every conversation, every shared silence, every moment of connection he had treasured. Had it all been a lie? A performance? So this, he gestured between them, his hand trembling. This was all. A game, she finished for him, her voice merciless. You set the rules, Your Majesty. I simply played it better. She reached into a small pocket in her dress and pulled something out. It glinted in the moonlight. A single silver coin. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it into the air. It spun, a tiny moon in the darkness between them, before falling to the stone floor, with a sharp, definitive clink. You lost, she said, her eyes boring into his. He saw no triumph in them, only a vast, empty weariness. I knew about the bet, and I felt nothing. Not for a single moment. I studied you. I analyzed your methods. I gave you the reactions you expected, and then the ones you didn't, to keep you off balance. It was an interesting intellectual exercise. Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile, beautiful thing he had built in his heart. But you, she continued, her gaze sweeping over him with clinical pity. You forgot the first rule of your own game. You were supposed to remain untouched. And now look at you. You're wrecked. She was right. He was. He was utterly, completely destroyed. The man who had stood here moments ago, full of hope and a terrifying, wonderful new love, was gone. In his place was a hollow shell, filled with the dust and ashes of his own arrogance. She looked at him one last time, her face a mask of impenetrable calm. My research here is concluded. I'll be gone by morning. And then she turned and walked away. She did not look back. He watched her go, the green of her dress melting into the shadows of the palace corridor until she was gone. He was left alone on the balcony, with the silent chimes, the indifferent moons, and the single silver coin gleaming at his feet like a final, mocking insult. He did not bend to pick it up. He simply stood there as the vast, cold emptiness of the next 1,000 years crashed down upon him. For a long time, Draven did not move. The sounds of the palace, the distant music, the murmur of voices, all faded into a dull, meaningless roar. The only reality was the cold stone beneath his feet and the gaping, ragged hole where his heart used to be. He had thought himself a master of games, a king of artifice. Lyra had shown him he was an amateur, a child playing with forces he did not comprehend. She had wielded his own cruelty and arrogance against him with the precision of a master duelist, and she had left him disarmed and bleeding on the field. He finally looked down at the coin, a simple piece of silver, a payment for a service rendered, or a prize for a game won. He understood its meaning. It was the price of her heart, a thing he had wagered for, and she had proven was never even on the table. It was worthless. And so was he. A sound, raw and broken, tore itself from his throat. It was a sound of pure agony, a sound no one in the Obsidian Court had heard their king make in his 1,000-year reign. He brought his fist down on the stone balustrade, and the ancient rock cracked under the force of his grief and rage. Pain, sharp and clean, shot up his arm, a welcome distraction from the unraveling chaos within him. He turned from the balcony and strode back into the palace, his movements stiff, his face a mask of cold fury that sent courtiers scattering from his path. He did not go to his chambers. He went to his formal study, the room where the grand ledger was displayed. Lords Cale and Valerius were there, goblets in hand, smug expressions on their faces. They had clearly been waiting for him. "Your Majesty," Cale began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We heard the news. The 30 days are done. A valiant effort, to be sure, but the human spirit is a fickle thing." Draven did not speak. He walked past them, his eyes fixed on the iron-bound book. He laid his hands on its cover, the cold metal a familiar weight. Its pages held a history of his own boredom, a catalogue of casual cruelties, wagers on wars, on lives, on hearts, a monument to his own emptiness. "The sunstone mines are yours," he said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. Valerius's smile was triumphant. "A wise decision, Your Majesty. One cannot win them all." Draven's hands tightened on the book. "Get out," he whispered. "I beg your pardon?" Cale asked, his smile faltering. "Get out!" Draven roared, and the word was imbued with all the power and rage of his ancient lineage. The crystal goblets in their hands shattered. The tapestries on the walls billowed as if in a hurricane. A wave of pure, terrifying force slammed into the two lords, throwing them back against the far wall. They scrambled to their feet, their faces pale with shock and fear, and fled the room without another word. Draven was alone with the book. He stared down at the inscription for his latest folly. The heart of the human Lyra. It was a desecration. He had taken something pure, her name, her spirit, and scrawled it in this filthy ledger. With a cry of self-loathing, he lifted the massive book. It was impossibly heavy, weighted with the sins of generations, but his grief gave him strength. He raised it high above his head and brought it crashing down onto the obsidian desk. The desk, which had stood for 5 centuries, splintered and collapsed. He lifted the book again and again, smashing it against the floor, the stone cracking under the repeated blows. The iron clasps broke, the ancient binding tore, and the vellum pages, filled with elegant, cruel script, scattered across the floor like dead leaves. He was not done. He summoned his magic, a raw, untamed fire that erupted from his hands. The pages curled, blackened, and dissolved into smoke and ash. He burned it all. A millennium of casual evil, a legacy of heartless games, erased in a storm of fire and regret. He stood panting in the center of the ruined study, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt history. Destroying the book had not eased the pain. It had only cleared the stage, leaving his agony in sharp, stark relief. He had destroyed the symbol of what he was, but it did not change the fact of it. And then, through the smoke and the grief, a single, desperate thought pierced the gloom. She had said she was leaving in the morning. It was not yet morning. He had to find her. Not as a king, not as a predator, not as a player in a game. He had to go to her as the broken man she had made him, and he had to beg. He didn't bother to change his fine court attire. He didn't summon a guard or a horse. He simply ran. He fled his own palace like a thief, his heart a frantic, desperate drum against his ribs. He ran through the silent corridors, past the shocked sentries, out into the cold night air. He knew where the guest quarters were, the modest rooms assigned to visiting scholars. He found her door and did not bother to knock. He threw it open. The room was sparse, and a single valise lay open on the bed, half packed with books and simple clothes. Lyra stood by the window, her back to him, her shoulders rigid. She had not yet changed out of her green gown. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice ragged, breathless from his run. She turned slowly. Her face was pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. He saw now what he had been blind to on the balcony. The cool mask was gone. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression not of triumph, but of profound, bone-deep sorrow. The coin had not been a mark of victory. It had been an act of survival, an act that had cost her dearly. "The game is over, Draven," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You lost. I won. That is the end of it." "No," he said, taking a step into the room. "You were wrong. You said you felt nothing. That was a lie." Her chin lifted in defiance, but a single tear escaped and traced a silver track down her cheek. "It doesn't matter what I felt," she whispered. "It wasn't real. It was a response to a fiction you created, a beautiful, perfect, poisonous fiction." "Then let me make it real," he begged, his voice breaking. He took another step, closing the distance between them. "Lyra, please, look at me. There are no lords here. There is no wager. There is no king. There is only a fool who fell in love with a brilliant, infuriating, magnificent woman. A fool who is begging you for a chance to earn a single, genuine smile from you." He fell to his knees before her. The king of the obsidian court, who had never knelt to anyone, knelt on the cold stone floor before a human scholar. He reached out, not to touch her, but in a gesture of supplication. "Throw it all away," he pleaded, his eyes searching hers, desperate for a flicker of hope. "The wager, the game, the 30 days. Let it be ash, like the book it was written in. Let us start again, today, now. My name is Draven. I rule this kingdom, and I am hopelessly, irrevocably in love with you. Will you allow me to court you? For real this time. With no lies, no games, only the truth, however ugly it may be." He knelt before her, stripped of all his pride, all his power, his entire fate held in the gaze of the woman he had tried to break. He had wagered his heart and lost it completely, and now he was offering up its shattered pieces, hoping against hope that she might, somehow, find it in hers to help him put them back together. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing, waiting for her verdict. Lyra looked down at him, this ancient king reduced to a man on his knees, and felt the careful walls she had built around her heart begin to crack. She had planned this moment 1,000 times in her mind. She would be cold. She would be unmoved. She would leave him shattered as he had intended to shatter her. But theory, she was discovering, was a pale shadow compared to the reality of seeing genuine anguish in those violet eyes. "Get up," she said softly, her voice lacking the steel she had intended. "Lyra, please," she interrupted, her own voice breaking. "Just get up." He rose, slowly, unsteadily, his eyes never leaving her face. He looked wrecked, vulnerable in a way she had never imagined possible for someone so ancient and powerful. And she realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that her own game had failed as spectacularly as his. She had told herself she felt nothing. She had catalogued every manipulation, analyzed every gesture, kept her heart locked away behind the armor of her intellect. But the armor had been made of paper, and somewhere between the library conversations and the snow in the highlands, it had dissolved completely. She had fallen for him. Not for the king, not for the seducer, but for the man who had shared his loneliness, who had listened to her theories with genuine fascination, who had looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in all his long existence. "I lied too," she whispered, and watched his expression shift from despair to cautious, fragile hope. "On the balcony, when I said I felt nothing." She laughed, a broken sound. "I'm a terrible liar, apparently, because I felt everything, every moment, every conversation, every time you looked at me like I mattered." She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold the pieces together. "I told myself it was all part of my plan, that I was studying you, staying detached, playing the game better than you ever could. But the truth?" She met his eyes, her own bright with unshed tears. "The truth is I was terrified, because falling in love with you was the most foolish, dangerous thing I could possibly do. You were supposed to be the villain of this story, the cruel king who wagered with hearts. But then you became you, the man who remembered how I take my tea, who understood my loneliness because you carry the same weight, who looked at me not as a prize to be won, but as an equal to be respected. When I heard about that wager, she continued, her voice strengthening, I was so angry, not just at you, but at myself, because some part of me had already started to care, and I felt like a fool. So I decided to beat you at your own game, to make you fall while I remained untouched, to prove I was smarter, stronger, better than some lovesick girl who would throw away everything for a beautiful face and pretty words. She took a shaky breath. But I wasn't stronger. I was just more stubborn and more afraid. Draven stood frozen, afraid that any movement might shatter this impossible moment. The coin, he said hoarsely, on the balcony, was me being cruel, she admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. I wanted to hurt you the way I thought you intended to hurt me. I wanted you to feel as broken as I was afraid I would be. But the moment I saw your face, the moment I walked away, she pressed a hand to her chest. It felt like I'd carved out my own heart and left it bleeding on those stones. The silence stretched between them, fragile and trembling with possibility. I don't know how to do this, Lyra said finally. I don't know how to trust this. You built our entire relationship on a lie, and I answered with my own deception. What kind of foundation is that? The worst possible one, Draven agreed, taking a careful step toward her. But perhaps that's where we start. With the truth. The ugly, painful truth. He reached up slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and gently wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb. The truth is that I was a monster who forgot what it meant to feel, who saw hearts as toys and emotions as weaknesses to exploit. The truth is that you changed me. Not through the game, but in spite of it. You challenged me, confronted me, refused to be diminished by my power or dazzled by my magic. His hand trembled against her skin. The truth is that somewhere in these 30 days, I stopped being the king who made that wager and became a man who would burn his entire kingdom to ash if it meant earning one genuine smile from you. I love you, Lyra. Not because you were a challenge or a prize, but because you are brilliant and fierce and achingly kind, even when you have every right to be cruel. The truth is, Lyra said, her hand coming up to cover his where it rested against her cheek, I love you too. Even though you're arrogant and manipulative, and you made a despicable wager that should have been unforgivable. She turned her face into his palm. Even though trusting you terrifies me. Even though I know that loving an immortal means I'll be a brief, flickering moment in your endless existence. No, Draven said fiercely, his other hand coming up to frame her face, his violet eyes blazing with an intensity that stole her breath. You will not be a moment. You will be the moment that everything changed. The line that divides my existence into before and after. Before you, I was sleepwalking through eternity. After you, I am finally, terrifyingly alive. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closing as if in prayer. I cannot promise I will always be worthy of you. I cannot erase the cruel, callous creature I was. But I can promise that every day, for as long as you will have me, I will strive to be the man you see when you look at me with those impossibly perceptive eyes. I will spend centuries earning your trust, if that's what it takes. Lyra felt something unlock in her chest, something that had been clenched tight with fear and anger and self-protection. She pulled back just enough to look at him fully. I have conditions, she said, and watched a smile, genuine, unburdened, achingly hopeful, transform his face. Of course you do, he murmured. You wouldn't be you without conditions. Name them. Anything. First, she said, holding up a finger between them, no more games, no more manipulation. If you want something from me, you ask. If you're feeling something, you tell me. Even if it's ugly or difficult or makes you feel vulnerable. Done, he said immediately. I am discovering that vulnerability is far less terrifying than the alternative of losing you. Second, she continued, Captain Reese gets recalled from the northern border immediately, with a formal apology and a commendation for his service. You don't get to punish good people because of your jealousy. Already drafted in my mind, Draven said. He'll be back within the week, with my personal apology and a promotion if he'll accept it. Third, Lyra said, her voice softening, you have to let me finish my research. I didn't come here to fall in love with a king. I came here to be a scholar. That part of me doesn't disappear just because my heart has decided to complicate everything. I would never ask you to be anything less than who you are, Draven said seriously. Your mind is one of the things I love most about you. I will support your work, facilitate it in any way I can, and try very hard not to be a distraction, though I make no promises on that last part. Despite everything, Lyra felt a laugh bubble up. You're terrible. I am, he agreed solemnly, but I'm your terrible if you'll have me. She studied his face in the moonlight, this beautiful, ancient, impossible man who had started as her would-be destroyer and become something far more dangerous, someone she could imagine spending her life with. It was insane. It was reckless. It went against every logical, careful principle she'd built her life around. I'll have you, she whispered, and watched joy, pure, radiant, unguarded joy, flood his features. But, Draven? Yes? If you ever make another wager that involves someone's heart, mine or anyone else's, I will personally ensure that the northern border posting looks like a vacation compared to what I do to you. He laughed, the sound rich and genuine and free. Noted, feared, and accepted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet box, his hands steady now. I had planned to give you this tonight, before everything. He opened it, revealing the simple silver band that held the light of a single star. This isn't an engagement ring. I'm not fool enough to think we're ready for that, but it's a promise. A promise that I will court you properly, with honesty and patience. A promise that I will earn the trust I broke before I ever had it. A promise that whatever we build together will be real. Lyra looked at the ring, then back at his face. May I? He asked, and she nodded, holding out her hand. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, the captured starlight warm against her skin. It's beautiful, she said softly. Not as beautiful as you, he replied, then caught himself. Sorry, was that too much? I'm trying to find the balance between honest admiration and the flowery nonsense I used before. She laughed again, and this time it was light, genuine, free of the weight of games and deception. It was a bit much, but I'll allow it. This time. Generous of you, he murmured, pulling her closer. I'm a generous person, she said, her arms sliding around his neck. It's one of my many excellent qualities. I'm beginning to catalog them all, he said against her lips. It may take several lifetimes. Good thing you have several lifetimes to spare, she whispered. And then he kissed her. Not the calculated kiss of a seduction, but the desperate, grateful kiss of a man who had been granted an impossible grace. She kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring into it all the fear and anger and love and hope that had been warring in her heart. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Draven rested his forehead against hers once more. Stay, he said simply. Not as my guest. Not as a scholar on a grant. Stay with me. Let me love you properly. Let me prove that I can be worthy of this. I'll stay, Lyra agreed, her fingers threading through his hair. But I'm keeping my own quarters, and my library access, and my independence. I wouldn't dream of taking any of it away, he promised, though I reserve the right to visit your quarters frequently. Purely for intellectual discourse, of course. Of course, she said dryly. Because you're suddenly so interested in prelapsarian trade routes. I am fascinated by prelapsarian trade routes, he said with absolute seriousness, particularly when they're being explained by a beautiful scholar with ink stains on her fingers and a tendency to gesture wildly when she's excited about a theory. She pulled back to look at him suspiciously. Are you mocking me? I am adoring you, he corrected. There's a difference. Outside the window, as if the universe itself was blessing this fragile new beginning, a soft sound began. It was delicate, crystalline, barely audible, but unmistakable. The whisper-wind chimes, silent for centuries, had finally begun to sing. Lyra's eyes widened. Is that? Yes, Draven said, wonder in his voice. He took her hand and led her to the window. In the distance, on the balcony where their world had shattered and reformed, the crystalline chimes swayed in a wind that touched nothing else, their song a cascade of pure, ethereal notes. I thought you said they only responded to the purest expressions of joy, Lyra said softly. I did, Draven replied, his arms sliding around her waist. It appears I was telling the truth for once, even when I thought I was lying. They stood together in the moonlight, listening to the impossible music, two people who had played the most dangerous game and somehow, miraculously, both won and lost, and found something far more valuable in the wreckage. Draven? Lyra said after a long moment. No more games? No more games, he promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. Just this. Just us. Just real. Just real, she echoed, and smiled as the chimes sang on into the night, their melody a promise that even the most broken things could be made beautiful again, if only someone was brave enough to try. And in the morning, when the court awoke, they found their king different. The boredom was gone from his eyes, replaced by something warm and alive. He walked the halls with purpose, laughed with genuine amusement, and treated his courtiers with a kindness that bewildered them. And beside him, not behind him or beneath him, but truly beside him, walked a human scholar with ink-stained fingers and a ring of starlight, who had taken a monster's game and transformed it into something neither of them had expected. A love story written not in grand gestures and false poetry, but in truth, trust, and the terrifying courage of two lonely souls choosing each other despite everything. The Obsidian Court would never be the same, and neither would they.